On a warm summer's day in 1967, 10 experienced cavers entered Mossdale Caverns. Only 4 made it back out again. What happened to them remains one of the darkest chapters in UK caving history. On the 24th of June 1967, a group of 10 young cavers aged 17 to 26 from Leeds University and the Bolton Happy Wanderers Club trekked the nearly 3-mile walk through the beautiful countryside to get to Mossdale Caverns, a complex caving system in the Yorkshire Dales. The 10 cavers planned to split up into 2 groups. Group 1 were Dave Adamson, Bill Frakes, John Ogden, Jeff Burrow, Colin Vickers, and Michael Ryan. They were a group of highly experienced cavers and were planning on further opening up and mapping out the cave system. They even intended to blast out blocked sections of the cave and were all confident in what they had planned. The second group consisted of Dave Adamson's fiancée, Morag Forbes, and their friends Jim Cunningham, John Shepherd, and Colette Lord, who was the only other woman in the group besides Morag. They weren't as experienced as the first group of cavers, coming along for the adventure and to improve their skills. They only planned to travel a small portion of the cave system, aiming to reach a part known as the Rough Chamber. It should only take them about an hour to get to, then they planned on turning around and making their way straight back out again. The Yorkshire Dales is a rural and picturesque part of Britain, known for its beautiful protected countryside. It's a haven for outdoor enthusiasts, drawing in countless hikers, cyclists, rock climbers, canoeists, and adventurers every year. It's also very popular for caving, being home to many caving systems, including the Three Counties system, which is the longest cave system in the UK. It's also home to one of the largest caverns in Britain, making it the ideal place for those who enjoy this kind of exploration. But amongst the tranquility of the rolling fields, stunning waterfalls, and the beautiful natural landscape lies unthinkable danger. The Mossdale Caverns is a cave system that's known to be challenging. It's mostly long, narrow tunnels with little room to stand or take a break. It's also prone to rising water levels, and it can take a very long time to get through. It's estimated to take around 8 to 10 hours to explore your way through the system and return, in one of the most claustrophobic environments imaginable. Both groups made it to the caves at around 2 p.m. The 6 men in Group 1 planned to head in first. So Dave Adamson said goodbye to his fiancée, Morag, and ventured into the darkness, followed by the rest of his team. Then Morag and the other 3 in the second group followed shortly after. As they all crawled into the darkness, they could never have imagined the horror that laid ahead. As the only 2 members who had entered Mossdale Caverns before, Dave Adamson and Jeff Burrow were leading the group that day. They had a job to do, so were pushing on at a steady pace. Morag and Group 2 never caught up to them again that day, but for a while they could still hear them up ahead. The first stretch of the cave offers a little bit of room to maneuver, but then it quickly turns into tight, narrow passages, creating a claustrophobic's worst nightmare. After just over an hour, they finally reached the Rough Chamber, a part of the cave described as being a fair-sized opening and a good place for the group to gather and turn around. Group 2 were relieved to be done with the first slog of their journey and looking forward to making their way back to the surface. Morag and Colette weren't cavers and didn't even have wetsuits on, but had gone along for the experience, and after nearly an hour in the damp, eerie darkness, they were more than ready to turn back. By the time they reached Rough Chamber, they hadn't heard a sound from Group 1 for a long time. It was clear that they had already moved on far ahead into the cave system. Morag and the other three emerged from the cave at around 5 p.m. The weather had taken a turn for the worse, and the sky was now grey, overcast, and spitting with rain. And as they all walked back to a nearby hut, Morag confided in Jim that she was getting worried about Dave and the others. The group stopped at the hut to change their wet clothes and to have something to eat. Then Jim, John, and Colette said their goodbyes, packed up their stuff, and went home for the day, leaving Morag to shelter at the hut. Morag planned on waiting it out. She knew her fiancé Dave and the others weren't due back until around midnight, and she intended to wait right there. Her and Dave were due to get married later in the year, and I imagine she'd have passed the time thinking about their big day and planning small details of the wedding in her mind. Meanwhile, the 6 cavers pushed on, deeper into the darkness. They had passed through an entrance at the back of Rough Chamber and were crawling on their hands and knees for nearly 200 meters through what's known as Rough Passage. At one point, they had to squeeze themselves under a large boulder to continue, and the tunnel never allowed them to do more than crawl. In places, they even had to pull themselves on their sides just to get through the tiny space. They were all fit and healthy, but even they must have been starting to get tired by now. They'd already been crawling and dragging themselves through the rugged tunnels for over 3 hours at this point. And their bags containing everything they'd brought with them would have been tied to their feet and pulled along behind them. They'd be aching, their clothes wet and cold from the water that constantly trickled along the cave floor. It's possible that if they weren't on such an important and exciting quest to further map out the tunnels, they too may have returned with the others, as the journey ahead was no easy feat. They were planning to reach the high-level mud caverns in the hopes of blasting and excavating the southern side, a place that would still take them hours to get to. The group then reached a part of the cave system called Far Marathon Passage, a small, narrow tunnel sized just 24 inches wide by 10 inches high, that went on for a treacherous 900 feet. That's almost like crawling the height of the Eiffel Tower. This was a grueling stretch, which would have the 6 cavers pulling themselves through the tight tunnels on their stomachs. And once they'd made the decision to maneuver themselves into the tight passage, there was no turning back. Even if they wanted to, the tiny space wouldn't allow the opportunity to turn around again for at least another hour of exhausting effort. They had no choice but to keep pushing forward. Morag had been waiting patiently back at the nearby hut. A couple of hours had passed since she had exited the cave, and even though she knew that her fiancé Dave was an experienced caver and knew what he was doing, she couldn't help but worry about the man she loved and their 5 friends who were still pushing on inside. Especially since the weather had been steadily getting worse. What started as some gentle rain had quickly turned into a heavy rainstorm. Morag decided to walk back to the cave entrance to see if they had decided to cut their journey short. She had hoped to bump into them on her return, or at least see them making their way out as she got to the entrance. But to her disappointment, there was no sign of them, and she made her way through the torrential rain back to the hut to keep waiting. Eventually, the 6 men reached the mud caverns. This is where they intended to get to work on excavations and mapping. But it was about this time that they had begun to notice that the flow of water entering the cave had started to creep its way up their ankles. This must have caused alarm bells to ring in the cavers' minds, and team leaders Dave Adamson and Jeff Burrow decided that they needed to go back. They knew that it was still going to take a harsh 3-hour crawl through the watery tunnels to get to the exit, and the situation was getting worse by the minute. The sound of raging water started to get louder, rumbling and echoing throughout the darkness, and they could feel the icy water rising fast all around them. Panic would have started to set in as the cavers scrambled to make their way to safety. One by one, the men quickly re-entered Far Marathon Passage. Jeff Burrow, who was second in command, re-entered the tunnel first, guiding the youngest, Michael Ryan, who was just 17 at the time. Then they were soon followed by Morag's fiancé Dave Adamson, then Bill Frakes and Colin Vickers. But as John Ogden was about to crawl into the passage following after his friends, the group had already realised their mistake. They'd have likely yelled out to each other, telling themselves to go back, but it was too late. There was no time left for them to attempt to shimmy back out. They were trapped in the tight tunnels as the water rapidly started to rise. They desperately tried to get their heads above the rushing water. Jeff and Michael, who went in first, frantically pulled themselves forward and up onto a ledge above. The others kept trying to make their way through, dragging themselves whilst turning over and pressing their faces against the roof of the tunnel, grasping for small pockets of air before the raging current flushed through the passage. John Ogden frantically tried to get to safety. He spotted a crevice above him and pushed his body inside it as far as he could and hoped that the water would pass underneath him. There was a small glimmer of hope that he'd be safe there, tucked away in a small pocket of air above. If he could only stick it out until the water levels dropped, he might stand a chance. It was now 9 p.m, and Morag was starting to get very worried about the 6 cavers. She quickly left the hut again and hurried back to the cave. But to her horror, the entrance was nowhere to be seen. Her stomach dropped as she realized it was completely submerged and hidden from sight below a lake of raging water. She felt panic wash over her, realizing the imminent danger the men must be in, and she ran through the pouring rain with all her strength, determined to get help as fast as she could. As Morag ran frantically, I can't even imagine the fear and worry she must have been feeling. She must have been fighting off her worst fears with every step she took, but she carried on running for over 2 miles before she finally reached a nearby farm to raise the alarm. The farmer quickly called the police and a rescue team set out at around 11 p.m. Others who were in the area at the time described how the raging storm and heavy rain that day had turned the nearby Mossdale Beck into a raging torrent. With water levels rising unexpectedly fast, leaving the entrance to Mossdale Caverns completely submerged by the flooded stream. By 1 a.m, every caver in the local area had shown up to help with the rescue effort. Jim Cunningham and John Shepherd, the experienced cavers who left with Group 2 earlier, also returned to join the rescue team. It's estimated that over 300 people came to help with the rescue efforts, and they worked tirelessly throughout the night. Locals and emergency services used pumps, machinery and tractors, and by morning they'd dug a 6-foot ditch that went on for over 300 foot to divert the flooded stream. Although the makeshift dam was far from perfect and needed to be constantly repaired to keep the raging flow of water away, it was working. And as the water level slowly started to fall, the cave's entrance gradually reappeared from the murky lake. By mid-morning, it looked as though the cave had drained enough for rescuers to finally enter. The rescue team had high hopes. The men were experienced cavers, and they believed they might have managed to reach higher ground to wait for rescue. As they entered the caves, they even started calling out to the men, yelling to let them know that the water was gone and that it's safe for them to come out now. The rescue team made their way through the muddy tunnel, which was still waterlogged, and set up a small base in the rough chamber. The exact place where Morag and the second group of cavers had turned back during the previous day. They'd even managed to run a telephone cable into Rough Chamber to communicate with the world above. However, the rescue team couldn't go further than this without the help of someone who knew the caves. As they weren't mapped yet, and hardly anyone had experience of Far Marathon Passage. So they waited in Rough Chamber, still crawling down the tunnels occasionally, in the hopes that the missing men would hear them and start making their way out. It made sense that they might have been too nervous to immediately climb down from wherever they took refuge, without knowing if the floods would return first. So hopes were still high that the men were okay, and that they were just safely waiting to be rescued. By the afternoon, a man named Tony Waltham had arrived on the scene. He travelled from London as soon as he heard the news, and he was one of the few people who had actually explored Far Marathon Passage before and could help guide the rescue team safely through the difficult route. He wasted no time in making his way to Rough Chamber, where others had already started clearing away debris from the rough crawl that had been swept in by the rushing water. Then he led a team of 9 rescuers into the tiny tunnel of Far Marathon Passage. They managed to make good time, working diligently to navigate the small space, and they were making good progress when Tony spotted something glistening up ahead. It was a caving headlamp that was caught over a piece of rock. From how it was laying, it didn't look like someone had dropped it, but more like it had been swept there by a harsh torrent of water and had hooked itself over the raised surface. But still, they had hopes that maybe it was just a spare that had got swept away, or maybe it was knocked off one of the cavers in the chaos as they quickly made their way to higher ground. The rescue team kept pushing on deeper into Far Marathon Passage. Tony recalled how he was starting to feel good as they got nearer to the entrance of the mud caverns. He thought that it wouldn't be long before they would be reunited with the missing cavers and could all go celebrate the success of the rescue mission. But those happy thoughts would abruptly disappear as he turned another tight corner and was faced with the heartbreaking sight of 4 neoprene-covered legs sticking out from the passage in front of him. It was Jeff Burrow and Michael Ryan. They were the first back into the tunnel, and in their desperate attempt to outrun the water, they'd wedged themselves up into a side rift, leaving their legs sticking out into the tunnel behind them. Tony and 2 other members of the rescue team then turned back to deliver the tragic news to Rough Chamber and make the call that nobody wanted to receive. The others kept crawling further up Far Marathon Passage. They still desperately wanted to find the others, maybe with some small hope still that some of their friends may be held up somewhere out of harm's way. But now they couldn't help but cry as they pressed on with the unforgiving crawl, having to witness the aftermath of yesterday's tragedy firsthand. Tears were rolling down their cheeks as their expectations of finding anyone alive were getting slimmer by the second. That's when they found Dave Adamson, Morag's beloved fiancé. Bill Frakes and Colin Vickers were then found a little further down the passage. None of them stood a chance. Ultimately, they were completely trapped in the tiny tunnel when the water came flooding in. Dave Adamson had previous experience in this cave system and had even reassured the others before they set out that day that there were safe places they could go to where water couldn't reach if the worst should happen. But tragically, it seems even with that knowledge, they didn't have enough warning or time to make it to those places. At this point, the rescuers, struck with grief and exhaustion, turned around. The crawl back must have been agonizingly slow, as the emotional impact of the day set in. Passing their lifeless friends and seeing the destruction of the flood all around them, it must have really sunk in just how dangerous this place was. Knowing they were also trapped and wondering if at any moment the same thing could happen again, inflicting the rescuers with the same awful fate. I'm sure if they'd have known what was happening outside, they would have turned back sooner, as unbeknownst to them, more heavy rain was on the way. And the makeshift dam had already dramatically failed, with cavers having to throw themselves in front of the rushing water, using themselves to block the flow as others rushed to repair it. Above ground, worries were growing that the cave may flood again, and everyone was ordered out for their safety. 5 bodies were found that day, but there was some brief confusion on how many cavers were missing, and it wasn't until further talks that they realised John Ogden still hadn't been found. By now, it was late on Sunday evening, and the bad weather conditions had put a stop to the search. But there was a fresh sense of motivation in the air, as there was new hopes that John may have reached the safety of the high-level mud caverns. But it wouldn't be until Monday afternoon that it was safe enough for them to enter the cave again. 2 teams re-entered the caverns, but they only made it as far as Rough Chamber before being urgently called back out due to rising water. Then another attempt was made on Tuesday, when rescuers finally made it down Far Marathon Passage and all the way into the high-level mud caverns. Their hearts sank as John was nowhere to be seen, and all of a sudden their hopes of finding him alive entirely dissolved. They searched and searched, but there was no sign of John. Eventually they had to give up and make their way out. A new rescue team went in, and at around 3 a.m. on Wednesday morning, they had spotted what they believed were the soles of John's boots. After all that searching, he was found less than 15 feet away from the others. He hadn't made it out to the safety of the mud caverns, but had instead pulled himself into an extremely tight crevice, wedging himself awkwardly into the tiny space above. It was a scene which showed the utter desperation of his ordeal, as he had forced himself into a space that wasn't even big enough for a human to fit in, squeezing himself beyond his limits in the hopes for one more breath of air. It was quickly decided that retrieving the bodies wasn't an option. The risk of more floods and the difficulty in moving them through the cave just made it too dangerous a job. The decision was made to close the cave, sealing the 6 men inside. It wouldn't be until 3 years later when some of their friends returned and moved them to a hidden passage off the high-level mud caverns. It was appropriately named the Sanctuary and is the final resting place of the 6 cavers. Mossdale Caverns remains closed to this day, and for good reason. Some places, no matter how tempting, should never be explored. So if you ever decide to give caving a go, be sure to always listen to any warnings. Do your research and check the weather conditions. And remember, if anyone ever asks you to, never ever go to Mossdale Caverns. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's story, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It only takes you a second, but it means the world to our small channel. Until next time, take care.